Привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Мене звати Ангеліна Карякіна, а зі мною
Наталка Гуманюк.
Ми з тобою говоримо через певний час після Мюнхенської безпекової конференції, на якій ти була, і була можливість у тебе поговорити з абсолютно різними людьми, що вони там говорили, але за цей час сталися певні речі. Ми розуміємо, що кожного дня щось стається, кожного вечора є певні заяви, певні дії, але все-таки важливо нам їх окреслити, з важливого.
Я говорила з Сільві Кауфман. Це редакційна директорка Le Monde, французького видання, відома французька журналістка. Свого часу вона була першою жінкою головним редактором Le Monde і є їхньою головною дописувачкою з питань міжнародних відносин. І мені здається, дуже важливо там дещо розказати про весь бекграунд Сільві. Для мене було ключове питання після всього, що сталося з Трампом, після скандалів, угод. Вже ми говорили після твітів Трампа, негативних про Зеленського, після виступу Венса. Ми з Сільві зустрілися на Мюнхенській конференції, і ми, в принципі, разом сиділи поруч і слухали виступ президента Зеленського. Так? А потім я вже записувала з нею інтерв'ю пізніше, після того, як в Парижі Макрон зібрав людей. І що мені було цікаво?
Європейських лідерів. Людей.
Після того, як Макрон у Парижі зібрав європейських лідерів. Який фокус цієї розмови, що ми намагаємося, який ребус розгадати? Звісно, дуже багато говориться про Дональда Трампа, про Зеленського. Це головні новини в світі останні дні, тиждень. Але ж питання яке? Що Європа? От що реально...
Чи прокинулась Європа?
Да, і тому я обрала саме героїнею цього подкасту Сільві, була змога з нею поговорити, щоб, власне, розпитати, так, а чого чекати від Європи? Бо все, що зараз відбувається з Трампом, з Росією, вже на той час пройшли переговори в Ріаді після нашої розмови. Вони були до нашої розмови, перемовини в Ріаді. Але от якраз питання, а чого реально чекати? Я, певно, додам, що від часу нашої розмови, напевно, ключові історії – це ще більше твітів і інтерв'ю Дональда Трампа про президента Зеленського. Ми це обговорили. Це приїзд європейських лідерів до Києва на третю річницю повномасштабного вторгнення, де вони показали свою єдність. Це постійні розмови про ці рідкоземельні метали, але навіть і голосування в ООН, на яких Сполучені Штати в резолюції щодо війни проти України, вони разом з державою Ізраїль, тобто виходять Сполучені Штати разом з Росією, але так само з Ізраїлем, Нікарагуа, Північною Кореєю і Іраном, не підтримали Україну. Ось це світ, в якому ми опинилися. Мені здається, все навіть закрутилося після нашої розмови, яку ми мали з нею кілька днів до того.
Ну і останній штрих, який варто додати до цієї картини, все-таки Макрон не лише скликав лідерів європейських, він намагається зараз, не тільки зараз, так, тримати оцю лідерську роль в Європі, але він і встиг зустрітися з Дональдом Трампом. Ми з тобою буквально щойно передивлялися це відео, де він на обличчі стримував свої емоції, це було видно, але з важливого Макрон раніше заявляв, що зустріч з Путіним неможлива там після Бучі, Тепер він сказав, що про це можна говорити. Теж важливий, цікавий розвиток подій, але він наголосив, що ця розмова все одно неможлива без Європи. Власне, з цією метою він їздив на зустріч з Трампом. Ми подивимося, що з цього вийде, тому що попереду нова зустріч в Ріаді між російською і американською делегацією. Взагалі попереду ще багато всього.
Мені це все було куди менш цікаво, тому що це те, що змінюється щодня. Мої ключові питання до Сільві – це була взагалі умовно розлучення Сполучених Штатів і Європи. Чи здатна Європа безпеково захищати себе? Що змінюється? Наскільки Україна є тим приводом задуматися, прокинутися. Друге питання, і тут дуже важливо розповісти насамперед про нашу гостю, так? Упродовж десятка років, і я теж хотіла би поділитися цією історією, свого знайомства. Сільві, як я вже говорила, має там дуже впливову посаду, але вона була кореспонденткою ключовою в міжнародних відносинах французького видання. В 80-ті це була там перебудова в Москві, потім падіння Берлінського муру, Болгарія, Польща, всі країни. Вона дуже багато працювала і в Сполучених Штатах, і де завгодно. Але саме вона була тою кореспонденткою, яка почала висвітлювати Майдан, Мінські перемовини. І весь цей час, поки тривали Мінські перемовини, там вона і була тим самим джерелом, хто може кого я запитувала, а що французи, а що Оланд, а що Меркель. Я додам, що у Сільві Дійсно, вона і сама достатньо, вона там є у всіх, не знаю, борда, всіх якихось видань, її колонки друкуються там New York Times, вона фактично є експертом з геополітики. А її чоловік – відомий французький дипломат, він на час Майдану був послом Франції у Польщі, а потім там був і в ООН, і де завгодно, і перед своїм виходом на пенсію очолював французький інститут у світі. І окрім своєї посади, я розумію, що світ дуже добре знає французьку політику, французький істеблішмент, а також міжнародний вимір, французьку зовнішню політику. Тому мені було важливо загалом зрозуміти там позицію Франції, який він, як дивиться Європа. Це все-таки в чомусь, як мені здається, такий, я не можу сказати, інсайдерський, позиція істеблішмент, тому що є кілька таких людей, і для Франції це Сільві, і вона залишається, до речі, зараз вона є редакційною директоркою Le Monde, це фактично керівник ради, редакційної ради. Я теж, мені здається, дуже цікаво, як ми познайомилися з нею і її, скажімо, настрій, тому з нею завжди добре її запитати. Ми познайомилися під час Майдану, але в дуже специфічних умовах в Давосі, тому що на той час, коли були перші загибелі, я мала змогу поїхати як молодий лідер на Давоський форум, але той самий, тобто не там, де ми довкола не можемо зайти, а з всіма правами типу президентів і лідерів. Це така була програма для людей. Оскільки це були перші вбивства на Майдані, це зараз ми такий раз і заходимо в Давос, в Мюнхен, добрий день, всюди можемо бути українця. На той час світ українцями не цікавився, і фактично там Пету Коксу показати фотографію, що ось Нігоян і він загинув, це була така, чесно, якась дивна адвокаційна історія, тому що ти міг бути, ти міг бачити президентів, там були ще такі скромні українські сніданки, там були всі українські олігархи, до яких треба було приходити. Але річ в тому, що коли ти гість, в тебе є програма. І, наприклад, коли Петро Порошенко приїхав тоді в Давос щось говорити, Петра Порошенка в програмі не було, де Барозу, де якісь інші президенти. А в мене трошки за те, що в цій молодіжній програмі була програма. І ми оце з командою тоді
організовували українську делегацію.
Українську делегацію. І там ще був такий специфічний спосіб. У нас було 500 франків. Є ще такий формат вечері і обіди. Коли ти платиш 250 франків, ти їх не можеш інакше витратити, але витрачаєш на якийсь VIP-обід і VIP там вечері. І я обрала їх дві. Одну, де були міністри закордонних справ різних країн, і я пам'ятаю, що там було 5 столів, я дуже довго вгадувала, з ким сісти поряд. І сіла поряд з Марком Рютте. Він представляв Нідерланди, я пам'ятаю, ми вдвоє з ним за столом ділили колу, бо шампанське наливали, всі пили якісь вино, а ми, він, здається, не вживає алкоголь, І що було головне, що ти якби обговорюєш якісь питання, і потім за підсумками цей лідер столу встає і розказує, що говорили за столом. І от я говорила, що в нас там, ви говорите про демократію в Європі, а в нас людей вбивають за європейський прапор. І я точно пам'ятаю, що Рютте встав, це сказав. І я розумію, що це якісь дрібні речі, але мені зараз приємно це
згадувати. Дуже цікаво. Слухай, ти мені ніколи цього не розповідала, скільки ми спілкуємося.
І я завжди згадую, що от ми сиділи з Рютте поряд, 1,5 години говорили.
А другий 250 франків.
А другий 250 франків на вечерю. Барозо. Я побачила, що в програмі Барозо. І, здається, вечеря коштувала дорожче, ніж обід, а на кожному столі була модерато. Я таки сіла за стіл до Барозо, Сільві як модераторка цієї зустрічі, бо вона така модераторка Давоських форумів, я маю сказати належно. Барозо тоді, я зараз не маю скажу, яку посаду він конкретно займав серед посад в Європейському Союзі, сором, але Єврокомісії, очільник Єврокомісії. І це ж Євромайдан. І знаєш, вона мені постійно надавала слово. І я говорила про Майдан, звісно, скільки могла, в кожного свої 5 хвилин. І після цього Сільві запропонувала мені зробити інтерв'ю. Вона на наступний день зробила статтю про Майдан в Le Monde. А я чесно вам кажу, на той час майже не було статей. Тобто люди гинули, але на передовицях статей з Майдану не було. І потім вже, коли Майдан переміг, але Росія почала вторгнення в Крим, до Донбас, Сільві вже приїжджала в Україну. Вона час від часу приїжджала в Україну і, скажімо, була таким контактом, вона запитувала, вона приходила у нас на громадське, вона завжди переживала. Вона якось з того часу з нами, але це був її, так би мовити, бід мінські перемовини, і оця вся історія з Нормандією, і змінювалися Фійон, Макрон, всі змінювалися, міністри закордонних справ. її можна було питати завжди. Знаєш, коли ти там питаєш, і я там скажу, що я їй страшенно вдячна, вона продовжує модерувати всі дискусії про Україну, і, до речі, кажу, що планує приїхати. Стільки там, завжди дуже зайнята, але вона під кожен раз ми останній час зустрічається, вона планує на кілька місяців приїхати в Україну, писати Карплушка. А тому вона, якби, я вважаю, теж така непересічна людина. І, скажімо так, дійсно, ми говорили про зараз стільки всього відбувається, але я, власне, хотіла їй трошки пояснити оцю перспективу. Чи вірять європейці в переговори, в Мінськ умовно 3, як вони до цього ставляться?
Мені здається, про Трампа все зрозуміло, про адміністрацію Трампа все зрозуміло, а от як буде реагувати Європа і яке майбутнє трансатлантичного об'єднання, так, альянсу, це якраз дійсно зовсім сіра зона, яку ще треба з'ясувати, так.
Я думаю, як завжди, з Європою все, просто, немає єдиної відповіді, але я сподіваюся, з нашої розмови ми, принаймні, зрозуміємо реальний настрій, бо все-таки він в європейців, трошки стабільніший, я б сказала, так сильно стабільніший, ніж
стабільно занепокоєний.
Але стабільніший, ніж того, що відбувається зараз в Сполучених Штатах.
Ну що ж, надзвичайно цінна розмова з редакційною директоркою Le Monde Сільві Кауфман. Слухаємо.
Sylvie, it's so nice to talk to you, and we had a chance to see each other in the Munich conference. But if there are questions about Europe, it's you whom I'm asking, not just about France. I'm in a very general term, want first to explain how you explain what's actually going on these days with Europe, with Trump, with Zelensky, in kind of a broader perspective. What is that? Is it like divorce of the US and Europe by withdrawing unconditional support, which was there for 80 years? Is it something like that? What do you write? What people in France say? How you assess it?
It's a trend that at least we in Western Europe didn't want to see for a long time. Even, I would say it started with George W. Bush, maybe with September 11. So it's since the beginning of this century. I was there in 2000 and 2001. I was a correspondent in the US at that time for my newspaper. The Clinton years, the 90s, were something where we thought everything was fantastic. It was just after the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet world. And, of course, Yeltsin was a bit crazy, but, there was a rich dialogue going on. And, okay. Then September 11, and the United States retreated inside. I mean, there was this really stupid invasion of Iraq, where the United States took with them some Europeans, United Kingdom, Italy, the new Central European democracies, and that already divided Europe because France and Germany didn't go along. And then, it was the beginning of a process of the United States drifting more inside and farther from Europe. But the Europeans didn't want really to see this as a long trend. They thought it was because there was this mistake of the Iraqi war, and then Obama was elected after Bush, so in 2008. So we thought, okay, now they are going to go back to normal, and the Democrats will be in charge in the White House, and we will be together again, and the rift between the US and France and Germany were healed. We didn't want to see that Obama was, in fact, in his own way, in a more palatable way or more civilized way or more courteous way, pursuing the same trend, I think. And one particular incident in France, we remember very well, it was in 2013 when the Syrian dictator Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. Obama had drawn a red line. He had said if Assad uses chemical weapons, which is obviously illegal in regard to the international law, the US will intervene with its allies. In August 2013, this operation was supposed to involve France and the UK and the US, of course. President Hollande called Obama and said, so are we ready to go and strike and, implement this red line? already in the UK, the House of Commons had said that they didn't want to be involved, and Obama got cold feet and told President Hollande, no, we're not going. And so the French, of course, couldn't go alone. They needed the military support of American Air Force to do these strikes. So the sanctions was not implemented, and the red line was not implemented. And this was seen here as a sign that, Europeans couldn't count on the United States anymore to enforce international law. And then you had Crimea, 2014, and you had Donbass, and very weak reaction from both the United States and Europe. And then you had 2022. I'm not even mentioning Georgia in 2008. So this is a trend, as I started to say at the beginning, that the Europeans thought, would just go away. And of course, there was Trump in 2016. That was a huge shock. The relationship with Europe was terrible. But then Biden was elected. So we thought, okay, it was just an accident. And again, naively, we thought that the US would go back to the United States we always knew. Except that it was Biden who was the accident. And then now we have Trump again. And now we finally understand that this is very, very serious and we cannot work together anymore. Not so much that because we Europeans don't want to, but because the Americans don't want anymore. So that's the big shock of Munich.
Yeah, I remember very well how you were telling, that you are concerned during the first Trump term that Trump is not an aberration for the US. But these days, President Macron called summits regarding, let's speak about now, it's very clear Trump wants to have some talks with Russia. We even don't want to call them the settlement on Ukraine or the deal on Ukraine. It just talks with Russia. And the President Macron called people to come to Paris, the leaders. He was not really personally there. Yes, we'll have this talk. We now journalists in a difficult position, because things can dramatically change an hour after we talk. But still, what were discussed? How was it? What does it mean? Was any agreement, let's say, in this, I think Ukraine is quite a showing case, let's say like that. So, if the people can't agree on this thing, can they agree on something else further? Ukraine is a good reason to think about something and do together. So what was happening with these meetings?
There was a couple of meetings, but the main one it was the one that President Macron called just after Munich. So that was a selected number of countries. It's interesting, in fact, the composition of that group, because here we are presented with a problem, us Europeans. When I say Europeans, usually I mean the 27 of the EU. On Ukraine, we cannot agree on something strong among 27. So our rules imply that we must have a consensus. But because of Hungary, basically, we know that we are not going to have this consensus. So for some time already, some Europeans, including France, have been trying to work in a more effective format involving the most resolute countries, if I may describe it this way, or so you can call it also a coalition of the willing or whatever. But that means countries which are most concerned or most active on Ukraine, and countries which really count in the European Union or outside the European Union. That's why the UK is involved in this group. So we have, for instance, the Weimar Plus, this format we call Weimar Plus, which originally the Weimar Triangle is France, Germany, and Poland, which is a good format because it represents more or less, the main geographic poles of the European Union. And then they add the UK, Italy, sometimes Ukraine is invited also to join this group to try to have serious conversation about what has to be done and how you can involve a wider circle. The aim on Monday was, I think, they knew that they were not going to produce any kind of decision or concrete results, but they wanted to show that they were reacting to this very powerful initiative or behavior from the US and from, the speech of J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance in Moscow, and this kind of aggressive stand of Washington and its willingness to get closer to Russia. First, there was the image, the picture that they wanted to show that we are reacting. We are not idle. We're doing something. Now, of course, for instance, they discussed like what security guarantees they could bring to Ukraine if in case there was a ceasefire agreed, and they couldn't agree. But this, I'm not surprised. They had a 3-hour meeting with different views, with Chancellor Scholz, who will not be in office 1 week later, with Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, who has her own view because she's close to Elon Musk and she has a good relationship with Trump. So, there was no way they were going to decide anything about security guarantees in that kind of meeting, but at least they floated some ideas and they, yes, indeed showed that they didn't agree on everything, including on, the question of putting European troops in Ukraine. But there will be further meetings, and very interesting that the Secretary General of NATO was involved in that meeting. Mark Rutte, he was there. It shows that they want to work with that there's a military NATO dimension to this initiative. But I have to say, generally speaking, on the mindset of the Europeans at the moment, they're in disarray. They are lost. I mean, lost may not be the word. That was the word last week, probably. They know they have to react. They know the situation is extremely dramatic. We are talking now finally about increasing our defense budgets with figures that nobody would have dared to mention like 3 months ago. But there's still a lot of work to be done to sell all this to our public opinions in Europe. Maybe in Poland, in Denmark, and in Estonia, we are very much aware of what's going on. But in France, in Italy, it's very different. So there's really a lot of work to be done. And I'm not sure everybody understands the urgency. It's now dawning on our leaders that this is extremely urgent because of the speed with which Washington and Moscow are talking. Time is of the essence, and I'm not sure we will be fast enough. That's the problem.
When I have, chance to be on air, especially after the talks between Russia and the US, the question were always like, why you're not on the table? Europeans are also not invited. And I wanted to shift to discussion, saying like, the main issue is not asking and begging Americans let us in these talks, or like the Russians. That's kind of a wrong position. The position is like, we really need to get together and to understand if, for instance, the biggest risk what can happen to Ukraine is withdrawal of the American support. That's the real leverage. That's the real story. They can withdraw. What we do next? Because, Ukraine won't accept something which is totally not considering Ukraine's interest. And then there is a question, what could be these security guarantees? And I understand they didn't agree. But what is really on the table? What is really the European leverage? Again, like what can be described? Because also what is a bit confusing, that I think we all, found the speech of President Zelensky pretty strong. If we speak about the mood, urging Europe to do something, more or less like kind of preparing them for this week after the J.D. Vance speech. He was speaking, for instance, for some European common defense or army. And we know that European army is not really on the table, like the army as itself, because there is NATO, like the NATO exists. So what are the security guarantees? Are we speaking about defense capabilities? Can Europe substitute some? Where is the problem? What Europe cannot substitute if we speak about the American defense? What are really these guarantees the Europe can do? Because we all also want to say that Europe is not as weak as, it's projected. It's actually strong. The problem is to find this kind of confidence, in fact, to act. But what really could be discussed, should be discussed, even if it's not like one answer or one unified view at this stage?
Well, first of all, we don't know what is going to be agreed. We don't know what the terms of the ceasefire will be, if there is a ceasefire. So, of course, these discussions which are being held among Europeans are kind of abstract, right? Because it's very difficult to know how many troops you need when you don't know what they are supposed to do, right? That's one thing which has to be taken into account. The other thing is they know that this is repeated over and over, but it is true. Ukraine's security is also about Europe's security. So everybody knows that in some way, the Europeans will have to be involved physically because it's also about them. It's not only about Ukraine, it's also about us. One thing which is being discussed, one option is that in case of a ceasefire, whatever it means, which would, for instance, freeze the contact line, the Ukrainian army would hold the contact line, and then there would be European troops, but well behind, not as combat troop, as a kind of reserve force behind. But then the question arises, what happens to those troops, European troops, foreign troops, if they are attacked by Russian troops? So this is a huge question. This is why the Europeans say, if we put boots on the ground, we want to have a backstop, an American backstop behind, which is if we come under attack, then the US come and help us. But does the US agree with it, with this option? Is Trump prepared to accept that? That doesn't mean American troops. There won't be American troops in Ukraine, that's for sure. But that could be a kind of commitment to react. Now, the other problem of the Europeans is that they have troops, not all of them, of course. I mean, some countries do have troops, but their equipment is poor. They are under-equipped. European armed forces are under-equipped for two reasons. One, because they underinvested for decades because they assumed that the United States was just protecting them. And the other reason is that they have been giving a lot to Ukraine over the past 3 years. Like, look, Denmark gave everything it had to Ukraine. So the level of our equipment is low. So what some Europeans say is that they want the US to keep at least a big part, and I'm not a military expert, so I'm not going to go into details about what kind of equipment, but we're talking about heavy equipment, so that the Americans would keep part of their equipment in Europe for a couple of years until the Europeans are in a position to replace it. Yeah. So that's one option. I mean, some of these options are discussed during 2-3 days, 1 week. They are floated around, they are discussed, and then something happens and they are completely obsolete and something else comes up. So I don't know in 1 week or 10 days what will be on the table, but that was the after Munich conversation.
Isn't like it's going a bit too ahead of time? Because for Ukraine, the urgent kind of question is a bit different. It's really what we do, not when there is a settlement, but when more or less there is no settlement and the Americans are not there. They are pushing in Ukraine. And then, of course, there are this discussion, how you assess the European equipment. Is it there? Is it not? Is it totally not existing? Or sometimes it's kind of kept elsewhere. But Europe also has money to buy, to help. And Ukraine also will need the financial support because, withdrawing of US aid, but probably with some other things, Ukraine really sometimes need not that much the boots on the ground to keep the contact line. But before that, a clear funds to, produce, but also sustain what we have so the country doesn't collapse and Ukraine is kind of defending itself while, US is flattering with Moscow.
What I'm being told by European officials is that in terms of financial aid, the interest of the Russian frozen assets have been disbursed, have been already a tranche has been sent to Ukraine. I think it's about 5 billion euros or something like this, which allows the Ukrainian state to function for probably this year. Right? Of course, then, but that's another question. There's the huge question of the frozen assets themselves, which is like 290 billion, I think, which is an enormous amount of money that would be very, very helpful. But, there are all kinds of legal issues and financial issues around this. So that's another question. But for the time being, we are using the interest of those assets and they are given to Ukraine to function. Militarily, that's another problem because you need to have, what is available as equipment. Not only you must be able to buy it, but you have to find it. But the Europeans keep saying, we want to support Ukraine. We want Ukraine to be in a stronger position when negotiations come or whatever. So they are committed and they know they have to continue to support Ukraine with equipment and deliveries of weapons and so on. So this is going on, within the possibilities. But I think the commitment is there. They know that they cannot just pull out. I think there's really a feeling now that we're all in this together. And so if Ukraine collapses, we collapse as well.
I want to ask more about the discourse, and I'll express also my opinion that, after this Trump reaction to the Ukrainian president not accepting kind of like the deal, which is not the deal, it's not even like something, it's just like the same Russian ultimatum. There were discussions in Ukraine that disregarding what Ukraine says, how polite it is to Trump, because actually Zelensky didn't attack Trump openly. They just rather wanted to come up with the figures. But still, there were very nasty comments of Trump, and then later very nasty comments of J.D. Vance. We don't know what happens every single day. We heard that even in Washington, the reaction was that, it's not the case. The support of Zelensky is not 4%. It's really like way higher. There are the different figures, and the backing of Zelensky actually growing right away after these talks. Country is quite unified. What is the mood? And let's say, in terms of the narrative, how people in Paris or elsewhere, what is your feeling, let's say, see that? Because when we were there together, listening to Zelensky in Munich, after J.D. Vance, who was seen with a bit of, let's say, not much appreciation, to be honest, like people had to clap because it's polite. Zelensky was really speaking with a force. And of course, things happen after. But when I was going to Munich, I was the mood was from the foreign reporters as if we're there to bury Ukraine, and Ukraine kind of didn't come as a weak country just begging for help. But how it looks now, because also some of the European leaders have these fights with Musk, with Trump, this kind of Twitter war is there. How Ukraine is now seen more or less from, I'm not even speaking about the headlines, because headlines are the headlines, but just overall.
I will speak for France first. I think there is still a lot of sympathy and solidarity for Ukraine. I think a big majority of French people agree that that the Ukrainians are fighting very courageously, that they are attacked and that they are resisting in a way that, few people expected that they could resist such a huge army as the Russian army, and that cities are bombed every day and so on. So I think really most of us realize this and support this. Now, that's one thing to, support, have sympathy and so on. I mean, intellectually. Another thing is that the French are completely focused on their own problems. The war is far away for them. We do have hybrid war. We do have Russian disinformation coming at us and so on, but still, people don't feel under attack like they would feel in Estonia or in Poland. The perception of the Russian threat here is very, very different in the west of Europe than from the east of Europe. Can the French decide that maybe we should sacrifice some of our pension funds to help Ukraine? I'm not so sure. They don't realize that this is costing a lot of money, and that, at the end of the day, it's taxpayers' money. They don't know where all this money comes from. So, but when we have to really we have already increased our defense budget, but the government will have to do much more than this. And then there comes a day when the government has to tell voters, look, you're going to have to forget about subsidies in culture or in sports or in whatever, because we need to defend not only Ukraine, but our country. And this is going to be very painful. And this is not happening yet. Now, if you look at Germany, I think this is really a key issue. At least Trump and Vance are not involved in our political debate in France yet. But as you heard, J.D. Vance in Munich interfered directly into the German election campaign. He met with this far-right leader, Alice Weidel, of the AfD, and he refused to meet with Chancellor Scholz. So this is completely unheard of. And this is very destabilizing for a country like Germany. You know, the French were used to have our own problems with the US. We know how to deal with the US in a way. We don't feel so dependent on them. Maybe because we have our own nuclear bomb, I don't know, and it's a kind of historic tradition. But the Germans, it's totally different. They are really very dependent politically. I mean, their bond with Washington is really strong. So to have a vice president, not even mentioning Elon Musk, but coming to attack their own democratic process is something they couldn't think of a few months ago. And if you look at it, Germany has lost Russia in 2022. Their bond with Russia was also very historic, of a totally different nature from the American bond, but it was a very important relationship. It's broken, it's lost. They had to switch to completely different sources of energy. You know, they had to forget about the Russian gas. So that was a huge shock. Now they're losing America. You know, it must be really a terrible trauma for all these politicians and these intellectuals. And so it's very destabilizing. I hope that after the election, the Germans realize that, you know, they have to focus on Europe and build a strong European solidarity with Ukraine, and that we all have to act differently.
What can you tell about now kind of the mood, the discourse of the President Macron, where he is, also in two contexts? I'm curious to how you can explain, you know, this. He has different interesting relations with Trump because he is a bit also a mastermind of flattering, you know, like inviting Trump then to Eiffel Tower and kind of something Trump likes after some kind of quarrel, creating this type of the things, like it was, for instance, with the opening of the Notre Dame, you know, where after some kind of, again, argument, it's nice just to be in Paris. And also the new administration is like, okay, it's nice to be there, to be. So he has kind of some idea how to deal with that. I think Ukraine, unfortunately, we don't have Eiffel Tower and peace to invite, you know, President Trump and kind of flatter him that way. And that's what I was thinking. Like, we can kind of get him into the front line, but he won't go because he's not a brave man. So I want to speak more about like where Macron is, what is his in power, but also this idea how you can work with Trump. You know, what is the secret of flattering him?
You know, Macron's relationship with Trump in the first term was interesting because Macron tried, as you very well described, he tried flattering him and inviting him and so on. But Macron's goal at the time was to convince Trump not to withdraw from the nuclear agreement in Iran. And he failed. Trump did withdraw. I mean, the US withdrew from that agreement, which was really a very negative development. But anyway, so Macron failed in his endeavor, but he managed to develop a kind of working relationship with Trump, which at that time was very useful when France was involved in Africa, in Mali, militarily to fight jihadi terrorism. French troops were deployed there for several years, and they needed American support in terms of intelligence and logistics. And that relationship worked very well. So it was kind of under the radar, but the Americans were happy with it because the French were doing the job, and the French were happy because they had American military cooperation. This all ended in failure eventually last year, but that's another story. But so they have this relationship, which is not fantastic, but it's a working relationship. And yes, Macron can pick up the phone and call Trump, and Trump will answer the phone. Now, can they go further than this now with Ukraine and with this very dramatic turnaround? I'm not sure. Macron will definitely try because he has also a very weakened, very complicated domestic political situation in France. He's a much weaker politician now in France because he made a couple of very bad decisions. So he has to focus on the international scene and on his role. And also, I think out of conviction, it's not only, you know, kind of selfish political interest or his ego. I think he is also convinced because he had this erroneous policy towards Russia until 2022, and he has completely reversed his course, and now he's one of the strongest defenders of supporters of Ukraine, and I think now he's very personally convinced that this is the right way to go, and that's where the danger is for Europe, to give in to Russia. So I think he's going to try as much as he can, yes, to find a way to work with Washington and to avoid a catastrophe in Ukraine and in Europe. But he also has this firm conviction, which is very French. This is since General de Gaulle. The French think they have a role to play and that things shouldn't be decided between Washington and Moscow over our heads. This is really something which has been permanent for every French president. I remember that Macron insisted on that already early in his first term in 2017, 2018. All his mantra about European sovereignty and autonomic strategy and so on, this is that Europe has a role to play. Europe must be a political actor, cannot be just prey, if you want, or just a subject between Russia and America. So now we are exactly in this game, and he is going to try to resist it as strong as he can. But he cannot do this alone, of course, and that's where it's so difficult, that he has to rally his European partners. Maybe also Canada, I don't know, how he's going to do, but he definitely needs to rally as many Europeans around him as he can. And that's a challenge because his image is not so strong as it was, several years ago.
By the way, if to briefly, what was the major mistakes he did, just to understand at home?
This all has to do with the rise of the far right, which is a problem in France as it is in Germany and in many other countries in Europe at the moment. And of course, we see the results in the United States. So what happened is that we had European elections to the European Parliament in June last year. The result in France was a big show for the Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen. They got almost 30% of the vote. So that was a big shock because they had never been so high. And Macron's mistake was to immediately, a few minutes after the results of the European election was announced on June 9, he decided to dissolve the National Assembly in France and call for a snap election 3 weeks later. But the political parties were not ready. Everybody scrambled, and it was a very poorly organized election because the campaign was too short and so on. And it ended in disaster, which is that there was no majority in parliament in France. We have 3 blocks which are equals, the far right, the far left, and the center. And so it's impossible to govern. Since July last year, basically, we have an unstable political situation with already 2 prime ministers who had to resign, be replaced, and no majority in parliament. So Macron has accepted himself, which is very unusual, that he was responsible for this situation, that he made a mistake in dissolving the assembly so quickly. But now we have to live with this, and that's the problem, that everybody knows that he has to bear the consequences of this, and that's why his image and his prestige is weakened, I think, at least on the European scene. He has withdrawn from the domestic politics themselves in France. He leaves the prime minister govern, and that's why he focuses on the international activity. And he has to. There's enough to be done, so it's not a bad thing.
I want to ask about the arms, because I really listen to different people, and they say quite different things. Of course, there are no arms any longer available in the Denmark. The Baltics has given as much as they could to Ukraine. But France, am I not mistaken? But there are people who are saying France is not giving enough. Isn't France don't have enough, or France, it's quite a huge country, compared to, any other smaller. It has army. Of course, there are interests in Maghreb. There are interests in Sahel. I'm speaking about Africa, so you can imagine that the France, has equipment and the troops elsewhere, including Latin America, is it like France can do more, give more, provide more? Because France doesn't look like the country which doesn't produce anything.
Well, France has a very powerful defense industry, but it's working for export, basically. Yeah, it sells a lot to Gulf countries and Asia. And of course, it can produce for the domestic market, but then the government has to pay for it, to place orders and pay for it. And that's, we go back again to this issue of money. But talking about equipment, France has serious armed forces. They have withdrawn from Africa. It was like about 5,000 people. So it's not like it was a huge thing either. But yeah, it's fairly there are territories, little territories all over the world, more or less. But this is, I would say, a good point, because that means the French armed forces are used to be deployed elsewhere. And for the French public opinion, it's not an issue. It's not like in Germany or the countries, we don't mind. People think it's normal function of French armed forces to go elsewhere. That's not a political problem. Now, the problem, I think, is really the equipment. The French have been very secretive about what they deliver to Ukraine, and they have this reputation of talking a lot and acting less, promising a lot and not delivering so much. And so then our government says, no, it's because we don't want to go public about it, but at least what we give is very effective. Yeah, like the Caesar missiles or whatever. And it's true that some of that equipment has made a difference, but there's obviously not enough of it. Why don't they give more? I think there's a question. There are two reasons why. One is that we don't have much, because of underinvestment over the years. And the other reason is that the big wigs of Ministry of Defense or the generals and so on, they don't like to get rid of all those equipment, because they say there will be nothing left to defend our country, which is a bit, to me, again, I'm not a military expert, but, we are not going to be the first one on the line if the Russians attack, but still. No, I think the main reason is that we are under-equipped ourselves, or that the equipment we have is not completely up to date and so on. So they have given recently some jet fighters, the Mirage planes. We are training Ukrainian soldiers as well, and pilots. And does this really make a difference? I don't know, but it will go on. And I think, there will come a moment when the realization will have to be done that much more has to be done.
Sylvie, what can be the future of NATO? Rutte sounds very devoted, but I don't really understand how it can work without the US, because also you don't want to have a parallel structure. The European members of NATO are strong. They are on the Ukrainian side. Rutte is there. The talk is serious. Now there is this kind of talk of Trump, which kind of hates NATO, at least in his discussions, and wants more. What actually NATO can do without Trump, or like how much Trump can kind of stop and veto some of the processes? I'm not speaking about the accepting Ukraine, but like processes where NATO can be helpful.
That's a very good question, because you have noticed that Trump or the US is not talking about leaving NATO anymore. It's not in their interest to leave NATO. They have this organization which works well, which is old, and they don't need to leave. What they can do, of course, is to withdraw forces from Europe. That's what apparently they want to do. What would then be left of NATO is, knowledge and expertise in working together, in having different armies working together, because the EU is not a defense alliance. The EU, we now have a defense commissioner and so on, but he's working more on how to harmonize our defense industries, which would be a very important thing to do, and work with the Ukrainian defense industry and so on. But in talking about armies, the EU has very little to do about this. It's NATO's job. So I think even if the US decided not to play the game anymore, or to be a major actor in NATO, the Europeans would be left with a way, mechanisms of cooperation, of interoperability. There's no NATO army, but there is a way of making the armies of NATO working together. And that's, I think, can be useful in Ukraine, depending on what is decided.
What Russia today wants from Ukraine is not much different from what they wanted in their ultimatum in 2021. But what we call it now, even before this Riyadh meeting, we heard, let's say, rumors that, actually Russians want Minsk III without Zelensky. And now, again, this discussion about the elections is there. Musk is saying that, Trump is saying that it's really technically impossible to hold the elections under the martial law in Ukraine. And we speak about a real actually danger. It's not about the public will, because, in order to elections to be held in Ukraine, you need to not have martial law, which means the withdrawal of the troops, a different political process, which actually puts Ukraine in a very vulnerable situation, defense-wise. But I remember very well that I met you just few days before the signing of the Minsk II. It was in Munich. It was 2015, I think exactly 10 years ago. But I remember you were saying that the French government was saying that it was a very much tough negotiations, and Putin was very threatening, and it was a different situation in Ukraine. Ukraine was really, really weak. I was in Debaltsevo before that. I remember that, in somehow Ukrainians needed that type of the ceasefire. But of course, today we can say it was a trap. Russians were pretending to negotiate while militarizing the whole territory. And there was this numerous discussions, which I remember you were also following. Elections this way, elections that way, with these observers. For 8 years, we were all talking in these nuances. You tried to decipher what Fillon or the other government was saying, what were Germans saying, what is the modality, what is Steinmeier formula. It was a charade, let's say like that. We never solved it. Now, how you see that today yourself, reflecting all these years, how also now kind of these election things are seen. It's a second question, if the demand of the elections and kind of the demands of Russians are seen by the people like you, by the people elsewhere who were with us for 8 years of these talks, which we tried to guess and to decide, even in Paris when Zelensky met Putin in Élysée. How you see all that now, and how you see the discussion today about?
You said the word, you described it very well. It was a trap. It was a trap that Putin set to the Europeans and to Ukraine. I think Ukraine maybe knew it, but they had no choice because, as you said, the Ukrainian army was very weak and there was this situation in Debaltseve in the east. But the French and the Germans who headed that negotiations really thought that they could achieve something. And it's very strange to think that Angela Merkel, this is for me one of the biggest enigmas, it's how Angela Merkel, who knew the communist world, who was not a friend of Putin as Gerhard Schröder had been, she didn't trust him. She really didn't like him at all. But still, she thought she could negotiate and get something of an agreement with him. And Hollande went along. I think he didn't like Putin either. But anyway, now I think everybody realized that it was a huge mistake, that we were taken for a ride by the Russians because their diplomats are very effective in slowing things down and making everybody waste his or her time. You talk to diplomats, to French diplomats or German diplomats who were involved in those talks, not in Minsk itself, but in the talks after the talks they had to hold afterwards for hundreds of hours, painstaking talks, and sometimes via video because of COVID, Cossack and, chain smoking and discussing every sentence in, such paragraph of a project of agreement, whatever. And in fact, all what the Russians were doing was to gain time and make everybody waste his or her time and not implement the agreement. So now we know this. I'm not sure Angela Merkel or Hollande have really drawn the right lessons, but they are not in office anymore, so it doesn't matter. But I know that in Macron's team, they know that this is not something we should be getting drawn into now again. And they fear that what may happen with the American team now, because Sergei Lavrov, he knows very well how to handle this. He's a very seasoned diplomat, and all his team, Ushakov and all these people, they know how. Does Rubio know how to deal with this? I have no idea. I'm afraid not.
You said something interesting. Neither Merkel nor Hollande liked Putin, but it seems like Donald Trump does. Like, what it changes?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's really scary because, yes, if you think that Merkel and Hollande, who were not fools and knew what Putin was about, they fell for the trap. So what will Trump, who likes Putin, who admires him because he's a strong man and so on, is able to do it when you think that he may go to Red Square on May 9th, standing beside Putin and Xi Jinping, the president of the United States? Well, that's something, yeah. And it's not good news, definitely.
I'm shortly want to ask about, because you're in this also trilateral group on the, Japan, also Pacific cooperation. I really want to see, do you really think we are living in the world where, because that's something I saw in my mind, that Trump sees like America is for America. There is a great power. There is a great power in a strong man in Moscow, and there is a Xi Jinping in China. Like these three people, something like Putin has in his ideas. They are the strong ones, and they can decide between each other. What it looks like that the Trump wants to separate Russia from China. And kind of say that the Russia isn't openly going to partner with China before the American real confrontation with China. At the same time, it's quite clear Russia is so dependent on China that they can play this game, but they won't betray China. They won't be with the US. But now they look like a real allies. Maybe it's a momentary moment within this week. Something else will happen later. Trump was flattering with Kim Jong-un and it didn't work. So, everything can happen. But still, how you see this kind of a global divide? I know I didn't put Europe into the place, but where do you think the Chinese are? Where also the things are? How are the things in the Pacific? How the world, is looking into this setting, let's say like that.
It's interesting that the United States keeps saying, and it's not only Trump, it was already back to Obama, this pivot to Asia. So the United States has been saying for some time now that their priority is Asia, is China and the Indo-Pacific. Now, I don't see so much how Russia comes into the calculation, because Russia now is a vassal to China. I mean, Russia wouldn't be able to wage this war without China's help. I think Xi Jinping really dominates this game. The game now is really between Trump and China. I mean, between the US and China. Russia is not a huge actor in this, I think. The Chinese have been fairly silent at the moment. And we heard in Munich, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, being so nice to the Europeans and saying, but I think the Europeans should have a seat at the table when it comes to negotiate with Ukraine. And so, all the stakeholders have to be there, and China being, the ultimate defender of international order and multilateralism and so on. We'll see what happens with Trump, but it's one of the major questions of the moment.
Sylvie, you were there when the Berlin Wall was falling, when there was a communist bloc. You were reporting, I don't know, from Poland and Bulgaria, from wherever, from Berlin. It was like a Reagan time. But when you really retrospectively now read, it was like a long time ago for us. I know now these things from, articles and books. But now there would be some people who would say, Reagan was not easy. Reagan has a complicated relations with Europe. Also, he was like this kind of fighting the communists, but also there were cases when the Republicans were betraying their allies, withdrawing from the agreements, not being on their sides, not intervening in some of the wars. It kind of looks, there was one thing happening with the Soviet Union, but there were other things globally. And also, he sounded very erratic. He was not an easy character. If you speak about the domestic politics and the huge crisis which was also going on at that time in the 80s in the United States. So from that perspective, again, I'll see, how do you see the Trump coming? What is that? What is the difference for you? Of course, Reagan was not isolationist, but it was not that also ideal. It was not that easy that they are behind everybody, behind the principles, the democracies.
Well, there is one major difference, and that's actually what kept this bloc together under Reagan during the Cold War and for some time after the Cold War. It's democracy. It's the rule of law. I mean, United States under Reagan, maybe Reagan was not always an easy leader or president, but he was democratically elected. He dealt with politics as we do in Europe. He respected the rule of law, and the United States was a functioning democracy, just as Western European countries were. This was, something which we thought couldn't be questioned. It was a fact. It was the pillar of the Western Bloc, that we were democracies, all of us, and we believed in the same system. Now we have this major partner, which I don't think we can really call an ally anymore, breaking with this rule, with this tradition, with this essence of our cooperation, destroying this democracy. That's the major difference. You can have differences between allies, but if you function in the same system, within the same political system, you speak the same language, right? You can debate, you can talk about your differences, you can have very tense moments, but you speak the same language. We don't speak the same language as America anymore. So we don't know how to deal with this. Should we deal with Trump the way we deal with Putin? As a major adversary or with the Chinese, the European Union position with China is that it's a rival system. So do we have a rival system in the United States now? This is the new framework that we have to look at. It's very unsettling, but it's a huge difference.
I don't want to finish with that. I rather would ask you, what would you tell to the Ukrainians at this moment?
I don't know. I'm not in Kiev at the moment, but I can imagine that people must be, if we are unsettled in Western Europe, I can only imagine what the morale can be, or the questioning or the doubts can be in Ukraine. So I would say, don't lose hope. We are a bit lost at the moment in Europe, but we know that our future is common. There's no other way. There's still a lot of admiration for the way the Ukrainians have been fighting for several years, not only 3 years, but more than that. Our fate is common. So I really hope, and a lot of us are working for that in Europe at the moment. We hope that our leaders come to their senses and have the courage to explain to the public opinion what's at stake and the sacrifices that we are going to have to make also here, which are nothing compared to what you are experiencing. From my last trip in Ukraine, I've kept the app on my phone of the air alerts. I've turned off the volume, but I kept it because I want to see how often in Kiev you have air alerts, because that keeps me in touch with your reality in a way. And I think we should all do this. In France, we should, that gives you a sense of what is it living under attack, even when you're not on the front line, when you're far away from the front line. I hope we finally get to understand this here and draw the right conclusions from it.